An 8-year-old girl was thrown out of her house, like garbage, just because she wasn't related by blood. With nowhere to go, she curled up in an empty park. What if you were alone, abandoned, with no one to turn to? A soldier stopped. What he did next changed her life forever. Sit over there, the big table's for family. Delilah spoke as she dragged a broken plastic chair from the kitchen corner, stuffed a rolled-up newspaper into the cracked leg, and placed it next to a worn-out folding table. That table sat by the back door, completely apart from the large dining table in the center of the room, where scented candles, porcelain plates, and a full-themed tablecloth made it look like a magazine spread. Emily, 8 years old, didn't ask questions. She simply sat down quietly, her dress brushing the cold tile floor. Dinner in their Texas suburban one-story home went on like it did every other day. Ava, age 7, sat beside her mother, Delilah, beaming with a wide smile. Frank, Ava's biological father and Emily's stepfather, ate in silence, his eyes fixed on his plate. Emily had never been called daughter since her biological mother, Isabel Dawson, died in a car accident 2 years ago. Every concept of family had crumbled for her. She was only 7 at the time. After the funeral, Emily was brought to live with Frank Monroe, a man she only knew through a few faded photographs in her mother's wallet. Frank was her stepfather in name only. He and Isabel had lived together for several years but never legally married. With no other family stepping forward and no formal will left behind, the local court granted Frank temporary legal guardianship based on household records and a handful of old letters exchanged between him and Isabel. 4 months after Isabel's death, Frank remarried a woman named Delilah. From that moment on, Emily's world grew smaller, colder, and completely unfamiliar. No one mentioned Isabel anymore. No one came when Emily woke up from nightmares. Her bedroom was cleared out and turned into a storage room. Most nights, dinner was just leftover rice, if anything. Frank didn't hit her, but he never hugged her either. He didn't protect her and certainly never spoke up when Delilah scolded her as a burden. Nobody wanted the wings cold, but it's still edible. Delilah placed the plate down on the side table without even glancing at the girl. On the plate, one darkened chicken wing, a few boiled carrot slices, and a scrap of stale bread. At the main table, Ava was served the largest chicken drumstick, dripping in butter sauce. Delilah refilled her daughter's milk while Frank kept his gaze on the TV, where a low baseball commentary echoed from the speaker. Emily held the plastic fork, trying to separate the meat from the bone. Suddenly, Ava leaned over and spilled her glass of orange juice under the table, right onto Emily's dress. "Mummy, she spilled juice all over my dress." Ava cried, her voice shooting high and sharp. Delilah shot up from her chair, her face darkening. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Emily, are you messing things up again? Can't we get through one meal in peace?" Emily opened her mouth to explain, but Frank had already pushed his chair back and shook his head. He didn't say a word. He didn't even try to intervene. "Go get a rag, wipe all that up, then clear the table." Emily lowered her head, her bare feet stepping into the cold puddle as she made her way to the sink. She knew, like always, that saying one more word would only make things worse. After mopping the floor, she started washing the dishes one by one. Ava's plate still had sauce and soft breadcrumbs clinging to it. Her own had only a faint trace of grease, which she rinsed off in 3 seconds. As she put the plates on the shelf, Emily's eyes unconsciously paused on a photo frame placed high above, one of the few things Delilah hadn't touched. The photo showed a young woman with softly curled brown hair holding a newborn baby, a round little face with eyes uncannily like Emily's. That was her mother, Isabel. Emily stared at the photo for a long time. "I'm sorry, Mommy," she whispered, barely audible. Delilah passed to the kitchen doorway, then glanced back. "Don't look like you still have a mother." She didn't raise her voice, but it was colder than ice. Emily turned away and wiped the last corner of the table. The stack of newspapers under the chair had already gone mushy from soaking up water. Since Isabel died, no one in this house had called Emily daughter. Delilah only used her or that girl. Frank didn't hit or yell, but he also never once asked Emily if she needed anything. Ava, on the other hand, was the center of everything: new dresses, full meals, praise every time she memorized a poem. Emily had learned to stay quiet, not react, not interrupt. Outside, the sky had gone dark. Inside, the house was thick with the smell of food, the sound of the TV, and that heavy feeling Emily didn't know how to name. She sat back at the small side table and pulled an old notebook from her sweater pocket. She opened it, took out some worn-down colored pencils, most of them stubby, and began to draw a house with its door open, a mother with long hair bending down, reaching toward a little girl standing in the yard. Emily drew in silence, no tears, no smile. She just tried to keep the lines from wobbling as her hand started to shake. Can you imagine a child, so young, carrying such a heavy heart? Stay with Real Stories Diary to hear what happens next. She didn't know then that this would be the last time she sat in that house as just a regular child. Early in the morning, Delilah had already begun directing the house like an event planner, her sharp voice echoing from the living room to the kitchen. Today was Ava's 7th birthday, and everything had to be perfect. Emily was assigned the task of tying balloons. She had no new clothes, no gift to give, but still tried her best to make sure the balloon strings were straight and color-matched, just as Delilah had instructed. Her small fingers threaded the nylon string, carefully tying clusters of 3 balloons before hanging them on the plastic wall hooks. More guests showed up than Emily had expected, some of Delilah's neighborhood friends, 2 of Ava's paternal aunts, and a few classmates. While Ava wore a brand new princess dress and sat at the center of the large dining table with a tiered birthday cake and soft pink ribbons, Emily stood in the back near the dish cabinet, her back against the edge of the kitchen counter. No one asked Emily what she wanted to eat. Delilah glanced at her a few times but never called her over. Frank stayed in the living room, greeting guests half-heartedly with a beer in hand. Since early on, Emily stayed quiet, watching every time a guest handed Ava a gift. The little girl squealed with joy, beamed, and got hugged and kissed. One silver-colored box caught Ava's attention more than the rest. It was a gift from one of her aunts, and inside was a mini purple gaming device with a touchscreen. Ava swiped her finger across it, proudly showing it off to all the kids at the party. "Mum said this is better than a phone." "I'm the only one allowed to play with it," Ava said loudly, clearly for someone's ears. Emily turned away and continued gathering the leftover gift wrappers guests had left behind. She wasn't angry, just felt something hard pressing in her chest, like a small pebble had slipped inside her shirt and couldn't be shaken loose. When the party ended, Delilah called Emily out back to clean up the table. Cake crumbs were scattered all over the chairs, a smear of frosting had gotten on the fridge handle. Emily quietly wiped it all clean. She was washing the dishes when a sudden shriek came from the living room. "Mom, the game thing is gone." Delilah rushed into the room, followed by a few lingering guests. Ava was flipping over the sofa cushions, her eyes welling with tears. "I left it here, right on the chair. Somebody took it." The air in the house grew tense. A few guests exchanged glances. Frank stepped over from the living room, brow furrowed, but said nothing. Delilah tilted her head, her eyes scanning the room. After a brief pause, she turned toward the kitchen where Emily was rinsing the last glass. "Emily," Delilah's voice dropped lower, "did you see Ava's game device?" Emily shook her head, still holding the towel. "Not sure if you really don't know or if you're pretending," Delilah pressed, louder this time. Emily looked at her, then lowered her eyes and whispered, "I didn't touch anything." "Go to your room now." Emily hesitated but placed the towel down and walked up the stairs. Delilah followed close behind, the sound of her heels clicking in steady rhythm. The upstairs room was small and bare, just a bunk bed, a thin mattress, and an old desk. Emily opened the door. Delilah didn't wait. She marched in, yanked the pillow off the bottom bunk, and, as if she already knew what she was looking for, pulled out a purple handheld game console from underneath. The air went still. Emily's eyes widened. "I didn't know it was there. I didn't take it." Delilah held the device high, like a piece of evidence in a courtroom. "Didn't know what? It crawled into your pillowcase by itself?" "It wasn't me," Emily stepped back. "I never even touched it." Frank appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. Delilah turned to him. "See that? Not only is she poor, but she's a thief too." Like losing her mother gave her an excuse to lose her morals. Emily trembled. She made a move to run, but was blocked. Frank didn't look at her. He just spoke, flat and cold, as if responding to someone outside the door. "She's not my daughter. Do what you need to." Emily froze. For the first time, she heard it spoken aloud, not in silence, not in a shake of the head, but in words, clear, final. Suddenly, everything, the air in the room, the light from the ceiling bulb, the sounds from downstairs, felt distant and warped, like a dream cracking apart. Emily didn't cry, but her throat burned, like someone had wrapped their hand around it and squeezed. Delilah walked out with the game in her hand, victorious. Emily remained standing there, staring at the room, and in that moment, she realized it had never truly been her room at all. "Get out of my house now. There's no room for thieves here," Delilah screamed, her hand clutching Emily's small arm as she dragged her toward the front door, while rain pounded furiously on the tin roof above. Emily didn't have time to grab her shoes. She only managed to clutch a thin plastic bag that held a few worn clothes and a small notebook wrapped in duct tape, her most precious possession. Inside it was a photo of her birth mother, taken in the hospital years ago when she was still alive. The door flew open. Wind and rain blasted into the hallway. Delilah hurled the bag onto the doorstep, her eyes unblinking. "I warned you, one more time, and you'll be sorry. Now get out." Emily stood frozen, her eyes red, arms wrapped tightly around the notebook. From behind the living room curtain, Frank watched quietly. He saw everything, the shouting, the trembling 8-year-old standing barefoot in the downpour, but he said nothing. He simply adjusted the curtain slightly and let it fall, as if nothing had happened. The door slammed shut. Silence fell over the house. Emily bent down to pick up her bag. Her clothes were already soaked. There wasn't much inside, just a few threadbare t-shirts, a pair of pajama pants with loose seams, and an edict-old handkerchief. She turned away. Rainwater glistened across the street under the dull yellow glow of the streetlights. The distant sound of cars, shuttered houses, and no one out there but Emily on this freezing February night. Her bare feet stepped carefully on the wet pavement. She held the notebook tighter, as if letting go would erase everything that came before. Rain stung her face, and the wind blew so fiercely she had to stop several times, shielding her head with her tiny hands. Her wet shirt clung to her skin. Emily didn't cry. There were no more tears left. She walked past 3 blocks, crossed a grocery store parking lot, and reached a small park beside a preschool. The playground gate wasn't locked, just 2 iron doors that swung open with a gentle push. The arched canopy over the plastic slide was the driest place she could find. Emily crawled in, squeezing herself between the slide and the molded play wall. She took the oldest jacket from her bag and draped it over her legs. The rest of her body remained wet, the rain had long soaked through. Cold winds slipped through the plastic seams. Every gust made her teeth chatter. Hunger, cold, her heart thudded in her chest. Emily clutched the notebook tight. She opened it, her hands shaking, and flipped to the page where her mother's picture was taped inside. The woman was smiling, dressed in a hospital gown, holding a newborn wrapped in a blanket. "I'm sorry, Emily," she whispered. "Mom, what did I do wrong?" No one answered. The wind howled again through the slide. She curled into herself, trying to shrink smaller. The rain began seeping through the plastic roof, ice drops falling onto her hands. "It's so cold." Emily didn't know when she had fallen asleep. All she remembered was that in her dream, her mother came to her. She didn't say a word. She simply knelt down and wrapped her arms around the little girl, tight and warm. "I'm here," her mother's voice whispered gently. "I won't leave you alone." Emily smiled in her sleep, clinging to that imagined embrace as if it were real. But then, a drop of water landed squarely on her forehead. Emily's eyes snapped open. There was no one there, just the leaky plastic overhead, just the cold wind and the steady patter of rain pounding against the ground. She sat up suddenly, still clutching her notebook, her breathing coming in short bursts, her heart pounding like a drum. The dream had felt so real that waking up from it made the loneliness cut even deeper. No mother, no home, just a rainy night and the small bag beside her. Emily curled into herself, tucking the notebook beneath her to keep it dry. Then she lowered her head once more, this time with no dreams at all, only the sound of a soft sigh from an 8-year-old child, lost and left behind. Asterisk, how could someone so small face such a big world alone? Keep listening to Real Stories Diary to find out who changes her life. Asterisk. Ethan Crowley began his morning run like he always did. The air was still cold after the night's rain. Puddles gleamed across the pavement. The sky hung heavy with gray, not yet ready to break open with light. The man in his 40s wore a faded army jacket and a pair of worn-down running shoes. He wasn't in the military anymore, but the habits from those years clung to him like a second skin, waking early, breathing deep, running in rhythm, each step a drumbeat echoing old memories. The small park at the end of the street was still quiet. A light breeze rustled the bare branches overhead. As Ethan jogged past the playground, he caught sight of something tucked beneath the arch of the slide, a child, a girl. She was curled up in a faded coat, head bowed low, clutching a plastic bag tightly to her chest, like it was something precious. A puddle had formed beneath her feet. The wind slipped through the torn seams of her jacket like fingers finding skin. Ethan slowed down, instinct, training. He'd seen setups before, staged panhandlers, elaborate trafficking schemes. But something about this girl wouldn't let him move on. It wasn't her eyes, she never looked up. It was her stillness, the kind of stillness he'd seen in young soldiers after their first real battle, stunned by things they couldn't unsee. He was about to stop when a stocky man in a park security uniform approached the girl. His name tag read Joel, his expression tight with irritation. "You can't sleep here, kid. This isn't a shelter." The girl flinched, clutching the bag tighter, mumbling, "I'm just sitting for a while, sir." "Don't care. Move along now." He gave a small flick of his hand. The bag slipped from her arms, hitting the concrete with a thud, rolling once, twice, before it tore open. A worn notebook fell out, its cover frayed, pages yellowed and ink smudged from the rain. Ethan stepped in. "What are you doing?" The guard turned. "Who are you?" "Just a guy out for a run, but you don't need to treat a kid like that. She's been here all night. My job is to clear them out before the early crowd comes in." "You want to do my job, be my guest." Ethan looked at the girl. Her face was bruised, eyes swollen. That thin, torn outfit couldn't hold back the wind. He bent down and picked up the notebook. On the paper cover were a few scribbled words, "Emily's secret diary." "Is this yours?" The girl nodded, eyes still cast downward. "What's your name, Emily? Where are your parents?" She was silent for a few seconds, then shook her head. "There's no one left." Ethan exhaled. He pulled a small thermos cup from his backpack, the hot cocoa inside still warm, and handed it to her. "Here, drink this." Emily took it with trembling hands. The sweet scent rose into the cold air. She took a small sip, then lowered her eyes again, sitting still and silent. "When I was younger," Ethan said gently, "my father left me at the border near Mosul. I sat just like you, dirty, cold, hungry, and not sure if I could trust anyone ever again." Emily gave no response. He stood up, voice firm. "If you want to stay out here and keep getting pushed away, that's your choice. But if you want a warm shower, dry towel, and a proper breakfast, come with me." He turned and started walking, no pressure. But a few steps later, he heard soft, hesitant footsteps. When he turned, Emily was standing there, clutching her bag tightly to her chest. Ethan gave a small nod. "My place is just around the corner." Ethan's cabin sat at the end of the street, single-story, low roof, dark paint. An old rocking chair rested on the porch. A senior dog lay curled up in a wicker basket by the door. "This is Rex," Ethan said, pointing to the dog. "He doesn't bite." Emily stood at the edge of the porch, hesitant. Ethan opened the door and flipped on the light. "Come in. If you don't feel safe, you're free to leave any time. But at least the floor's dry in here." The girl stepped inside slowly, her wet feet leaving faint smudged marks on the wooden floor. Ethan fetched a towel, some of his niece's old clothes, and a warm bottle of milk. He set them on a chair. Bathroom's over there. The door locks. Emily picked up the items and walked in. The door closed behind her. Ethan poured 2 cups of hot tea and sat by the fireplace, his back slightly hunched, head bowed. The events of that morning had stirred old memories of a night in Kandahar after a raid, when he found the only surviving child under the rubble. A faint rustling broke the silence. Emily stood there, hair still damp, wearing an oversized hoodie. Her eyes avoided his, but in her hands, she held the cup of cocoa Ethan had left on the table. "Did you finish it?" Emily nodded. "Are you hungry?" "Bread, please." Ethan headed to the kitchen. A few moments later, he returned with a plate of peanut butter toast. Emily sat in the chair, eating slowly, so slowly, like she was afraid the food would disappear if she ate too fast. Ethan didn't ask anything more. He understood this child was testing his heart. That evening, Ethan laid out a spare mattress on the living room floor. "You can sleep here tonight. There's a night light, and Rex will stay right next to you." Emily nodded. As he turned away, she said softly, "Thank you, Uncle." He stopped, looked back at her, but said nothing. That night, as the wind rustled outside and the fireplace crackled, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat in the armchair, elbow on the armrest, chin resting in his hand, staring at an old photo of his sister, Isabel. The girl who vanished from their family after a terrible argument. People said she ran off with a boy, but Ethan had never believed that. That little girl had the same eyes as someone he used to know and a quiet resignation no child should ever carry. He closed his eyes. A decision settled quietly within him. Ethan opened the garage door, letting the late afternoon light filter into the room, which was thick with dust and memories. He was looking for a heavier coat for Emily. The forecast said it would turn cold tonight. In the corner, an old cardboard box lay quietly beneath a worn tarp. Ethan pulled it out. Layer by layer, old belongings appeared: yellowed newspapers, a faded cap, a few worn-out toys from his time serving in Iraq. At the very bottom, a small dark wooden box, its engraved letters faded with age: Isabel. "What's that, Uncle?" Emily asked hesitantly from behind him. Ethan picked up the box, turning it over in his hands. "It belonged to my sister, Isabel." The little girl stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the object. It was a tiny music box, no bigger than his palm, the wood chipped at the corners. Ethan gently turned the side crank, and a melody began to play, a soft, familiar tune, one that carried a quiet sadness he hadn't heard in years. Emily watched intently. "Can you open it?" Ethan nodded and pressed lightly on the lid. A soft click sounded, and then a photograph slipped out and fluttered to the concrete floor. Both of them knelt down. It was an old picture, a young woman cradling a newborn in her arms, her gaze as tender as morning sunlight. The woman's face looked strikingly like Emily's. Ethan froze, his fingers tightened around the photo. "Do you know who this is?" Emily slowly nodded. "That's my mum. Mum Isabel." Ethan looked at her, stunned. "What did you say her name was?" "Isabel Grant. She passed away when I was 6. Ethan exhaled sharply, nearly losing his balance. He sank onto the garage step and opened a small drawer beneath the music box. Inside lay a folded letter, the paper yellowed with time. At the top, in clear handwritten script, were the words, "To Ethan, from your sister." The letter had never been sent. Ethan opened it. "Ethan, if you're reading this, I'm probably no longer here. I know I was wrong to keep Emily a secret from you. I just wanted to protect you from more pain. But I should have told you. Emily is my daughter. She's your niece. If someday the two of you meet, please don't be angry with me. Love her the way you once loved me. Isabel." The letter slipped from his hands. Ethan couldn't speak. The whole world seemed to fall silent. He turned to Emily and looked at her for a long moment. "Do you remember where your mom lived before you were born?" "I don't remember much. Just once," she said. "Uncle Ethan's house used to have a big oak tree out front." Ethan dropped his face into his hands. He remembered that tree. It had been torn down by a windstorm in 2013, the same year Isabel disappeared. Ethan looked up, his eyes red, not from pain, not from the fatigue spreading from his shoulders down his spine, but from something slower, deeper, something he'd buried for years beneath a mask of silence, remorse, and regret. He swallowed hard, his breath caught halfway in his chest. His throat burned, not from the cold, but from the words that had been waiting far too long to be spoken. "Emily, I'm your uncle." The girl looked up, her wide eyes blurred with shock. The wind drifted in through the open window, the curtain stirred gently, as if leaning in to hear the confession more clearly. Ethan drew in a deep breath, gave a slight nod, almost as if confessing to himself. "I'm your mother's younger brother, the man she couldn't forgive because of one stupid fight years ago, one phone call I didn't answer, one letter I never opened. And by the time I wanted to come back, it was too late." He let out a sad laugh, the kind that echoes in the heart long after it fades. "I used to think I didn't deserve to be called family anymore, that I didn't have the courage to reach out or the right to claim anything." His voice grew softer. "So I tried to forget, but I never stopped watching from afar." Emily still didn't say a word, but she stepped closer slowly. In her hand was a small photograph that had just slipped out of her notebook, a faded old picture of her mother, Isabel, smiling brightly beside a young man in a military uniform, Ethan. Without a word, Emily opened her tiny hand and placed the photo into his palm, her fingers brushing the worn, calloused lines of his. "I think," she whispered, her voice still trembling, "Mom wouldn't want us to be apart anymore." Ethan didn't answer right away. He just sat there quietly, staring at the photograph in his hands, as if he were seeing an entire chapter of life, long gone, laughter echoing from the past, half-finished Christmases, years of growing up in separate corners of the world, and a sister who had passed on, always standing between the distance, hoping that one day her brother and daughter would somehow find their way back to each other. It was only after a while that he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, like whine through the trees. "I believe so." Ethan gently tightened his grip on the photo, as if holding on to the one fragile thread that connected him to the little girl sitting across from him. His heart, scarred, calloused, and shut down for more than a decade, was slowly beginning to open, not because of a plea or a phone call seeking forgiveness or any grand gesture, but because of the smallest things: a faded photograph, a pair of trembling hands, and a little girl curled up on a park bench in the cold, pouring rain. In that moment, he no longer felt alone. In that moment, he had a reason to begin again. And the little girl, Emily, did too. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, its reddish glow dancing across the low wooden ceiling. Outside, the wind howled through the window cracks, as if whispering of something unresolved. Ethan sat alone in the armchair, an old photograph of Isabel resting on his lap, the handwritten letter still open, left unfinished in the corner of the room. Emily lay curled up on the sofa under a thin blanket, her feet stuck out, and her palm remained slightly open, as if still holding on to something she wasn't ready to let go of. He watched the little girl for a long time and saw that look again, the same look that had once made Isabel so furious she walked out of the house 11 years ago, the look of not being accepted. Ethan sat in the armchair near the window, the dim yellow light casting shadows across the bridge group one, of his rugged nose and the hollow circles under his sleepless eyes. He tilted his head slightly, gaze drifting into a distant place, to memories he hadn't dared revisit in years. The last image of Isabel, his sister, 3 years older, came back as vividly as if it had happened just yesterday. She was standing at the doorway of their old house, arms wrapped around her belly, the baby inside her was Emily. Tears streamed down Isabel's cheeks, and her pale lips kept uttering the same broken, aching phrase, "She's not a mistake. She's not a mistake." That day, no one stood by her. Their mother, always proper, conservative, and consumed by appearances, just sat silently in the kitchen, clutching her rosary, eyes praying for something that never came. Their father, a stern former police officer, had slammed his hand on the wooden table, his voice thundering like a storm, "Get out of this house if you insist on keeping that child." There was no forgiveness, no space for explanation, only the door slamming shut behind Isabel. And she did exactly what he said. Isabel left that same night with just a canvas bag and the child still growing inside her. There was no phone call, no goodbye for Ethan. At the time, he was serving overseas in the military, in a desert of sand and violence. He only found out through a line in one of their mother's letters: she left. No one could stop her. Almost a year later, when Ethan was finally granted leave to return home, Isabel had vanished completely. She no longer lived at the old address, hadn't contacted any of her former friends, her phone had been disconnected. Someone, an old friend of their mother's, once mentioned that Isabel had worked as a traveling nurse in Missouri, but beyond that, all records, all traces, seemed to have been wiped clean, as if she had lived like a ghost, a woman invisible in the vastness of America. Ethan had searched. He even reached out to an old friend from his time in the Civilian Investigations Unit, hoping to trace a social security number or a hospital record, but there was nothing. Isabel had done what no one in the family believed she ever could. She cut all ties and vanished from their lives like a quiet streak of light in the middle of a winter night. And now, 20 years later, her daughter was sleeping in the guest room of his home. Emily, 9 years old, frail, tiny, with a bruise around her wrist and a restless sleep, like a baby bird startled in the rain. She flinched every time the wind rattled the windowpane, clutching a worn fabric pouch like it held the last remaining pieces of her world. Ethan bent over the wooden coffee table, his hand trembling slightly as he picked up the old envelope tucked inside Emily's notebook. Inside was a stack of thin papers, yellowed by time, the edges wrinkled from rain. Folded neatly in the center was a single page, protected more carefully than the rest, as if the girl already knew how much it meant. Ethan unfolded it, a photocopy of a birth certificate. Mother's name, Isabel Grant. Father's name, unknown. 2 italicized, bolded words, cold, hollow. He gripped the paper gently, as if he could somehow crush the pain buried inside it. Emily had never been officially acknowledged by anyone. Isabel had given birth alone, raised her daughter alone, guided her through a life stripped of family, identity, and any kind of legal support. She never asked for help, never knocked on her parents' door, like so many broken-hearted women do when they've nowhere else to go. Isabel lived and died like a ghost. Ethan exhaled deeply, the air felt heavy in his chest. He looked toward the living room, where a soft yellow lamp cast its glow over the small blanket draped across Emily's sleeping body. This child hadn't just been forgotten, she had never been welcomed in the first place. And he was the last one left who could do anything about it. Now he understood, the years he spent running from his past didn't just cost him Isabel, they made Emily bear the full weight of everything he had avoided, from the neglect of a broken system, the indifference of so-called parents, to the kind of loneliness that drives a child to sleep beneath a playground slide in the cold rain. He clenched the envelope tighter, his gaze distant. The old dog, Rex, stirred in his wicker basket, sensing the shift in the air. Ethan stood, walked to the window. The sky was lightening, a single thread of golden sunlight pierced through the thick morning clouds. Maybe now, no one in his family would have to live unseen ever again. Emily shivered in her sleep. Ethan gently pulled the blanket up over her, but his hand froze when it brushed against a bruise near her elbow, faded but still visible. He lifted her sleeve a little higher and saw a deep, bluish mark along the inside of her upper arm. This wasn't from a fall, this was from someone grabbing her hard. Ethan took a deep breath and quietly walked to the kitchen, turning on the cold water tap to steady himself. But inside, the anger was beginning to rise, slowly, steadily, like a tide he couldn't hold back. He had seen bruises like this before, on refugee children, on civilians caught in the crossfire, and now on a child of his own blood. He returned to the living room and sat down, watching Emily toss gently in her sleep. Her little legs trembled with each uneven breath, her tiny hand curled into a fist, as if still bracing for something. He sat there for a long time, not out of guilt, but out of resolve. This time, he whispered hoarsely, "No one is abandoning your sister's child again." Ethan stood, dimmed the lights, drew the curtains, and returned to the chair. Isabel's photo was still in his hand. He stared at it for a long while, as if waiting for her to nod from somewhere far away. Tomorrow morning, he would take Emily for a full medical checkup. And after that, he'd go see the lawyer. This couldn't stop at kindness, he was going to fight for custody, legal and permanent. The little girl had no one left, but now she had him. Ethan sat down on the plastic chair in the living room, a steaming mug of cocoa on the table beside him. Night had fully fallen, and outside, a gentle rain was falling. Emily curled up on the couch, knees to her chest, her eyes fixed on the fireplace flames. She hadn't spoken a word since dinner, not until Ethan sat beside her and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Did she finally speak, so softly that even the rain might have drowned it out? Uncle Ethan, if I tell you, will you believe me? He didn't answer, he just nodded. I didn't take that toy. I swear. Ava hid it and then pretended to scream. Her mum, Mrs. Delilah, she's always hated me. I eat alone, sleep alone, sit on a broken chair. They never hit me, but they scare me every day. Ethan said nothing. One time, I had a fever, and no one took me to the doctor. I spent the whole night in the laundry room because Delilah didn't want Ava getting sick. They call me the burden. Frank never looks at me, he just smokes and watches TV. When Ava messes up, I get yelled at. I've tried to be good, but it's never good enough. Emily lowered her head, her voice cracking. I don't know why my mom died, but I'm sure she would never treat me like that. Ethan clenched his fists. After a long silence, he stood up, walked into the bedroom, opened a drawer, and took out Isabel's letter and an old copy of Emily's birth certificate. Then he came back and sat down across from her. Tomorrow, I'm taking you to the Child Protection Center. I won't let anyone hurt you again. Emily looked at him, her eyes flickering between hope and fear. You might have to talk to some adults, but I'll be sitting right there with you. If they ask, just tell the truth. I'll handle the rest. The next morning, the sky was clear. Ethan wore a coat and carried a folder. Emily walked beside, plus or minus alongside him, her small hand gently clutching the hem of his jacket. At the Family and Child Services Center, they were led into a small meeting room. Sitting across from them was Mrs. Regina Hawthorne, a senior woman with silver hair pinned into a tight bun, her gaze stern, probing. Mr. Crowley, you're here to file for temporary guardianship of Miss Emily Holden? Yes. I'm her maternal uncle, Isabel Crowley's younger brother. Regina flipped through the file. We've never received any reports of abuse or neglect from the Holden household. As far as our records show, Emily has been residing with her legal stepfather. Because they kept it hidden, Ethan replied. But truth doesn't always show up on paper. Regina put her pen down. I'll need verification. We'll contact Frank Holden and his wife. An hour later, the sharp click of high heels echoed down the hallway. Delilah appeared, her dress perfectly pressed, her makeup meticulously done. She entered the room with a mix of shock and staged concern, followed by Frank, silent as a shadow. Oh my God, Emily is here. I've been worried sick, Delilah cried, dabbing at her eyes. She ran away, took off in the middle of a stormy night. We've raised her like our own since she was a baby, but she's always been rebellious. Just the other day, she stole Ava's brand new toy. Frank said nothing, he merely nodded, backing up every word his wife said. Regina turned to Emily. Do you have anything to say, sweetheart? Emily didn't respond. She kept her head down, gripping the straps of her worn backpack tightly, not a single word. Regina sighed. Has she had a history of running away from home? Ethan interjected, firm. No history, but plenty of signs. And one night sleeping in the park, if I hadn't happened to find her, we might not be here talking about guardianship. We might be identifying a body. He pulled out a birth certificate. Biological mother, Isabel Crowley, my sister. Here's her photo, and this is a letter she wrote, confirming Emily is her daughter. No legal father, no formal adoption. And now, I'm the only remaining blood relative. Regina took the letter and read it slowly, deliberately, word by word. Suddenly, Delilah slapped her hand on the table and stood, her voice rising to a screech. This is a setup. Can't you see that? Anyone can whip up papers like this, a stray kid, a few scribbled letters, a torn piece of paper, and that's all it takes to steal someone else's child. The room fell silent, the only sound the soft whir of the ceiling fan. Judge Regina didn't blink. She looked up, calm but cold as stone. Mrs. Holden, if you're alleging forgery, then I must ask, do you have any legal proof disproving the blood relationship between Mr. Ethan Crowley and Emily? Delilah opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Frank, who had been sitting quietly behind his wife, pale as a ghost, turned to her as if waiting for her to say something. She only stared at the DNA report lying on the table, her lips pressed together until they turned white. The judge gently flipped a page in the file. DNA testing confirms a 99.98% probability of a direct blood relationship between the uncle, Ethan Crowley, and his niece, Emily Holden. The results were conducted by an independent, state-certified laboratory. Delilah stepped back to her seat, her breath quickening. Regina paused, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom. Now, I'd like to hear from the one person who matters most here. She turned her chair to the right, toward where Emily sat beside her appointed attorney and a social worker. Regina's voice softened, but it still cut like a blade. Emily, can you tell the court who you want to live with? Every eye turned to the little girl. Emily flinched slightly, her small hand tightened around the frayed corner of her coat. Delilah gritted her teeth, leaning forward, whispering harshly through clenched jaws. Emily, remember, we're your family. Mommy always loves you, you know that. Frank kept his head down, unable to look up. Ethan said nothing, he simply rested a hand on his knee and gave Emily a small nod, not to pressure her, but to remind her silently, I'm here. Emily blinked once, twice, 3 times. Then she looked up, her eyes red, but no tears fell. Her voice was hoarse and trembling, but each word rang out as clearly as a morning bell. I want to live with Uncle Ethan. Silence, as if the air had been sucked from the room. Delilah shot up. No, she's lying. We raised her, we fed her, we sent her to school. Just because she got punished a few times, she thinks that gives her the right to betray us. Judge Regina tapped her gavel lightly against the bench, thud. Mrs. Holden, this is the last time I'll say it. I expect you to maintain order. Delilah screamed, tears streaming down her face, but they were the tears of defeat, not love. Frank hung his head, his fists clenched, but he said nothing, like a man who finally understood what he had lost. Regina turned back to Emily, then to Ethan. She nodded, her tone firm. The court will issue a final ruling after the closing arguments, but as the presiding judge, I acknowledge Emily's testimony as honest, voluntary, and carrying significant weight. Emily sat still, her small hand resting on the arm of the chair, for the first time no longer trembling. Ethan turned to Regina and spoke firmly. I'm the only remaining relative who has both the means and the moral capacity to care for her. I lost my sister once. I won't lose my niece too. I'm not here asking for approval. I'm here to make sure she lives with the dignity every human being deserves. And if I have to go to court to secure that, then I'll fight. Regina nodded slowly. This case will be forwarded to family court for a ruling on temporary custody. In the meantime, Emily will be allowed to stay with you under our supervision. Ethan gently squeezed Emily's shoulder. For the first time, she rested her head against him, as if it were the only safe place she had left. Emily sat upright on the soft blue velvet chair in Dr. Meredith Reed's counseling room. Dr. Reed was a young psychologist, but seasoned when it came to children who had been abandoned or traumatized. The room was calm and soothing, the faint scent of lavender making it easier for the girl to breathe after days of tension. In one corner stood a bookshelf, a box of crayons, a set of logic games, and a stuffed bear named Max. Why don't you draw me something you remember most about your old home? Dr. Reed said, her voice as gentle as a breeze. Emily didn't answer. She simply lowered her head, picked up a crayon, and began to draw. The white paper slowly filled with the image of a plain little house with 3 locks on the front door. On the porch steps sat a small girl, hunched over, hugging a torn teddy bear. Above her, dark clouds loomed, and scribbled lines of rain fell. What's the girl's name? Dr. Reed asked softly. Emily, the child whispered. The crayon stopped moving. As Dr. Reed reached for a folder beside her, she gently asked, Can you tell me some of the sad things that happened to you? I used to get locked outside if I ate too slow, Emily replied. One time, it was cold, and I only had a t-shirt on, but they still locked me out until dark. Dr. Reed quietly took notes, then gently asked, Who locked you out? My stepmother, and sometimes my stepfather too. Emily kept her eyes on her hands as she continued. During mealtimes, I had to wait until everyone else finished eating before I could enter the kitchen. I wasn't allowed to use the washing machine, so I washed my clothes by hand in the backyard. I couldn't go to friends' birthday parties because I was told I wasn't worth being seen. Then came the audio recording from a neighbor, Mrs. Clara, 67, played during the investigation. I saw that child put out in the heat of the day more than once. One time, I tried to give her a bottle of water. She was so scared, she wouldn't take it, just shook her head and ran back toward the dog kennel to get out of the sun. Next, the testimony from Emily's second-grade teacher, Miss Pruitt. Emily came to class in dirty clothes, smelling of cooking grease. One day, she laid her head on the desk because she was so hungry. I sent a letter home, but no one ever responded. A classmate named Naomi also spoke during the evaluation. Emily said her stepmom didn't let her sleep in a bed. She had to sleep in the kitchen corner. She cried a lot, but no one listened. A formal meeting was held at the Family Services Center. Ethan arrived with his legal counsel and sat across from Delilah and Frank. Miss Ramos, the family caseworker, opened the file and read the evidence out loud, line by line. Delilah shot up from her chair, voice shrill. "That girl's got a wild imagination. She made all this up just to live with someone else, to make us look bad." Frank stayed seated, expressionless. He didn't deny or confirm anything, only shook his head and muttered, "I don't think she fits into the kind of military-style environment that man's trying to create." Ethan's attorney gave a calm smile. He's not building a military environment. He's building a loving one. Dr. Reed was invited to speak. Emily is making remarkable progress thanks to the stable presence of her only remaining relative, her uncle. This case should prioritize emotional recovery, not continued placement with individuals who caused her long-term harm. Ethan didn't speak much, but when Emily looked at him, her eyes wide and wet, he held her hand tightly and finally said to the room, "I've lost someone in my family before. I won't let that happen again. Emily doesn't need another stranger. She needs a home, and I will be that home." The small courtroom in Bizarre County was unusually quiet that morning. On one of the long benches, Ethan sat upright in a neatly pressed gray suit that had seen better days. Beside him, Emily wore the sea-green dress she had picked out during a market trip with her uncle, her hair neatly braided, eyes fixed straight ahead, but her small hand clutched tightly at the hem of her dress. Across the aisle, Delilah entered, wearing a loud floral dress and an overly styled appearance. Frank followed behind her, silent as always, his gaze still carrying that familiar chill. Judge Turner, a woman in her early 50s with a stern yet composed demeanor, opened the session. Ethan was the first to be called to speak. "Your Honor," Ethan began, his voice not loud but firm, "I am Emily's biological uncle. I didn't even know she existed until a few weeks ago, but ever since I found out, I've done everything within my power to ensure her safety." He placed 3 pieces of evidence on the table: an old photo of Isabel, Emily's mother, a handwritten letter addressed to Ethan from 8 years ago, and Emily's birth certificate with the father's name left blank. Ethan's attorney then submitted a psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Reed, stating that Emily displayed signs of trauma stemming from prolonged neglect and discrimination within her former household. She was often forced to eat alone, locked outside in the cold, and overburdened with house chores, Dr. Reed testified. More importantly, there are numerous indicators that she lived in an environment lacking emotional care and timely medical attention. The atmosphere began to tense as Delilah's attorney rose to counter. "Your Honor, my clients, Mrs. Delilah and Mr. Frank, are Emily's legal guardians and have raised her since her mother passed away. Mrs. Delilah claims Emily frequently ran away, was disobedient, and exhibited stealing behaviors." Delilah quickly put on a show of tears, pulling a tissue from her purse. "I love that girl as my own," she sobbed, "but she's always been defiant, ungrateful, and even stole things from Ava." Ethan clenched his fists. He stood and looked directly at Delilah. That little girl was cornered, denied a seat at the dinner table, scolded over petty things, and in the end, thrown out into the rain in the middle of the night. "And you call that raising her?" Frank scoffed. "She's not my child. I'm not responsible for her." At that moment, Ethan's attorney called 2 new witnesses, Emily's 3rd-grade teacher and the owner of the laundromat near their old neighborhood. "Emily often came to school in dirty clothes, sometimes with a burnt smell," the teacher said. When I asked, she simply said she had to wash her clothes by hand because she wasn't allowed to use the machine. She was a good student, but over time, she became quiet, withdrawn, and easily frightened. The laundromat owner added, I saw her several times, coming to borrow fabric softener. Once, I noticed bruises on her arm. When I asked about it, she just looked down and stayed silent. The turning point came with the testimony of Ava, Delilah's 7-year-old biological daughter. When called to the stand, Ava appeared nervous, glancing at her mother. But after a long pause, she whispered, just loud enough for the microphone to pick up, Mom told me to pour water on Emily's dress, then pretend to cry. The courtroom fell into silence. Delilah shot up from her seat. She doesn't know what she's saying. She's just a child. Judge Turner raised her hand to signal silence. She made a note in her ledger, then looked over at Emily, who had remained silent the entire time, her eyes wide, as if afraid of everything that might come next. Ethan turned to her, gently holding her hand. Even if the court doesn't grant me custody, he said, voice trembling, I will keep fighting until she has a safe, dignified place to live. The judge remained still for nearly a minute before gently striking her gavel. A temporary ruling will be issued in the next session. However, due to clear psychological risk posed by the current household, Emily will remain under the protection and supervision of Mr. Ethan Crowley. Delilah and Frank went pale. Emily clung to Ethan. The moment they stepped out of the courtroom, for the first time, she cried, not from pain, not from fear, but from pure, overwhelming relief. Ethan's SUV turned onto the narrow lane, blanketed with late-season autumn leaves, crimson, orange, and golden. Maple leaves drifted lazily onto the windshield, like a gentle, hopeful greeting from fall itself. In the passenger seat sat Emily, clutching her old stuffed bear tightly. But this time, she wasn't curled up in the corner like she usually was. Her gaze was steady, looking out the window, the eyes of a child who had seen far more than any child should, but who was beginning, just barely, to believe in something good again. As the white wooden house came into view at the end of the road, with its deep red shingles, round window frames, and a quiet wooden swing under the maple tree, Ethan glanced over at the girl. This is home, he said softly. Emily didn't reply. She only tightened her grip on the bear, her eyes fixed on the swing. It was just a brief moment, but it was enough. Ethan could feel it, for the first time in her life, she truly felt like she was coming home. Which room would you like? He asked as he opened the car door. The one with the window facing the maple tree, Emily replied, her voice steady for the first time. Ethan led her upstairs. The room had once been his reading nook, now repainted in a soft shade of blue. A small bed with plaid sheets sat by the window. On a wooden shelf were a few children's books and a little star-shaped lamp. Ethan gently placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. You can change anything you want in this room. This is your space now. Emily sat on the bed, unzipped her backpack, pulled out her stuffed bear, and placed it on the pillow. She stroked its head, the way someone might soothe a child. I'll take care of it the way Mom took care of me, she whispered. The days that followed weren't always easy. Emily still flinched at loud sounds, still hesitated before eating, and there were nights she cried simply because Ethan had entered the room without knocking. But Ethan never rushed her. He taught himself to walk more softly, speak more gently, and always ask before sitting close. Some nights, he'd simply sit beside her without saying a word, just waiting until she fell asleep. Bit by bit, trust was rebuilt not with promises, but with a quiet, unwavering presence. One evening, after he'd finished reading a fairy tale, Emily looked up at him, her eyes clear. Why didn't you leave me like they did? Ethan didn't answer right away. He closed the book, looked into her eyes, and held her gaze for a long moment. Because you're my family, and family never walks away, no matter what. Emily nodded, a soft smile played across her lips, the first real one, no fear, no hesitation. A week later, the court held the final custody hearing. Ethan and Emily walked in together, hand in hand. The courtroom felt quieter than before. Delilah and Frank were no longer sitting on the other side. This time, it was Emily's teacher who stood up and read a heartfelt letter. She spoke of a girl who was quick to learn, kind to her classmates, and had started smiling again. Dr. Reed, the child psychologist, presented a 12-page report. Emily is experiencing an extraordinary psychological recovery, he said, largely due to a stable environment and the presence of unconditional love. The court didn't take long to reach its decision. Mr. Ethan Crowley is hereby recognized as the legal guardian and officially becomes the adoptive father of Miss Emily Isabel Dawson. Emily turned to Ethan, gripping his hand tightly as her full name was read aloud, publicly and rightfully, for the first time. In the courthouse hallway, Ethan lifted Emily into his arms and held her close. No one spoke. A few bystanders wiped away tears. Social worker Miss Reed, who had once doubted Ethan, was the first to step forward, pat his shoulder, and smile. I was wrong, she said gently. Congratulations to both of you. On her first day of school, Emily wore the red plaid dress Ethan had bought from the small store near their home. He braided her hair himself, fastened her backpack, and drove her to school. Right before she walked through the gate, Emily ran back and hugged him tightly. I'll try my best in class, she whispered. I don't doubt that, Ethan replied, then leaned down and ruffled her hair, his voice low but steady. You're my little miracle. That evening, the two of them sat on the backyard bench beneath a star-filled sky. Emily tilted her head upward and pointed to a blinking light above. My mom used to say, no matter how dark the sky gets, there's always one star you can still see. But now, I have two, she said softly. Ethan reached for her hand, his eyes misty, but his smile calm and full of peace. And from now on, he said, I'll be the brightest star in your sky, so you'll never lose your way again. 3 months later, her new birth certificate arrived, her new name printed in bold, dignified letters, Emily Crowley. 1 year later, on a gentle spring afternoon, Emily was seen riding her bicycle around the schoolyard, her hair dancing in the wind, her laughter ringing out like a melody of joy. Ethan, meanwhile, was busy launching a new project, a shelter for abandoned children called the Isabel House, a place where every child would be welcomed by the words inscribed on the sign above the gate, here, everyone deserves to be loved, and no one has to sleep in the park. Emily hung that sign herself. And when the sun set that evening, from the window of her room overlooking the maple tree, she whispered, Mom, I finally have a real home. Maybe we've all felt like Emily at some point, lost, misunderstood, or left behind in a world that seems too cold. But sometimes, all it takes is one person who chooses not to turn away, like Ethan, and everything begins to change. Today's story, from Real Stories Diary, isn't just about family. It's a gentle reminder that kindness doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be steady and real. Because sometimes, one open embrace becomes the home someone has been searching for their whole life. If you're going through a hard time, I hope this story, brought to you by Real Stories Diary, touched a place in your heart and maybe, just maybe, brought you a little warmth today. Do you remember who the star in your life once was? Or maybe you are someone's guiding light right now? I'd love to hear your story. Feel free to share it with Real Stories Diary in the comments. And if you haven't had water today or haven't taken a proper break, please be kind to yourself. Because here, at Real Stories Diary, you're not just a viewer, you're part of a community we truly care about.